Hey, movie friends, welcome back to Raiders of the Lost Podcast. I'm Anthony.
And this is James, and Pan's Labyrinth is a beautiful but tragic film. Guillermo Del Toro is one of the most creative directors, I would say, working today. You could call him like the master of monsters, not just because he creates unique monsters, but they symbolically represent the themes of the film or represent characters in the film outside of the monster realm. And I think he just has a beautiful aesthetic in all his films, specifically this one. I'm a huge fan of his work. I love, obviously, Blade 2 is such a cool film. I remember Mimic seeing that when I was young. Hellboy is great, but then Crimson Peak is an underrated movie of his. So he's just a great auteur filmmaker that we're just lucky to have working.
What about the Oscar-winning Shape of Water?
Shape of Water, of course.
Yeah,
of course. Shape of Water is great.
Yeah, I love Guillermo. And what's so cool about him is he's a contradiction, because if you see him on interviews and press and stuff, he seems so nice and warm and genuine and very kind and soft-spoken, but his imagination gets so dark and fantastical. And have you ever heard of his monster house that he has?
In his home?
Well, his home is it's basically like a monster house where inside of his home he has like all sorts of like disturbing, horrific like paraphernalia from movies and comic books, and like crazy statues and all sorts of set pieces and the craziest items of the macabre and fantastical. And it's like, and he also has a room in his house that rains. And it's called like the rain room.
You told me that.
So I think he has a very childlike love of storytelling, and he obviously gravitates towards the fantastical and creatures and monsters and stuff. But I think you can compare him to actually Wes Anderson, because they both tell fairy tales for adults. Wes Anderson does the same thing. His movies are whimsical, light, fun fairy tales for adults, whereas Guillermo, he tells dark, disturbing, fantastical, mythological fairy tales for adults.
Yeah, and just to stay on the monsters and that tone and the aesthetic of this horror that he has, his mentor was actually Dick Smith, who's one of the most influential special effects makeup artists of all time. And this guy had a legendary career, Dick Smith, including The Exorcist, Taxi Driver, The Deer Hunter, The Godfather. So that's just an idea to give you the kinds of movies he was working on before he passed. And he was a pioneer in the field of prosthetic makeup effects. And he changed Guillermo del Toro's life by taking him basically under his wing and helping shape his career as a young artist, because Guillermo was dying to work with him as a young kid in Mexico, when he was getting those prosthetic makeup horror kits to do his own short films and stories, his own monster prosthetics. But he eventually came under the tutelage of Dick Smith, and he helped shape this phenomenal artist where Guillermo you can tell this guy's brain is just full of creativity, and who knows what it looks like in there. And one of my favorite things about him is he has the sketchbooks that he comes up with all his ideas. He has tons of them, and drawings and just plot points where his movies and his stories come from. And it's cool to just look up those images of those drawings that he comes up with, because he's very talented artist in general. The best way to support Raiders of the Lost Podcast is to become a patron at patreon.com/Raiders of the Lost Podcast. Patrons get perks like messages, personalized videos, podcast schedules. Top tier patrons get a monthly shout out on the podcast. And also we do monthly contests for patrons only, so you'll be able to get entered into that automatically every month.
And he's actually very good friends with Alfonso Cuarón and Alejandro Inarritu, and they're like a group of young Mexican filmmakers when they met, and they've all known each other for a very long time, and they came up together in Mexico and also in Hollywood. And it's been so great to see that the three of them have each won their own directing Oscars over the past 8 years, and they've basically dominated the landscape of film in Hollywood. And they've brought their Mexican heritage and their storytelling and their Mexican roots into Hollywood in America in an amazing way. And I love that all three of them have found so much success, because the three of them are extremely talented. They're all very different. And Guillermo puts his own print on his film. And I think that you can compare him also to like someone like J.K. Rowling, where his movies, he bases a lot of his ideas and themes off ancient mythology, ancient storytelling, and he brings those ancient stories, ideas, beings, and he puts them into his own stories. And that's basically what J.K. Rowling did with Harry Potter, where it's ancient myths, it's religious myths that she wove into the stories of Harry Potter. And same thing with, like, if you look at The Hobbit, the Hobbit is the same thing as Chamber of Secrets, which is an ancient story of man battling a dragon or a beast, and these are all ancient stories. And Guillermo is a storyteller that brings these ancient stories into modern culture.
Yeah, and quickly, speaking of Alfonso Cuarón, he actually is a producer on this film, and he and Guillermo put up the first $100,000 for this film to get made because no studio wanted to give Guillermo money for this, even though he had just done Blade 2, he just did Hellboy, which a lot of people really liked, and a lot of studios wanted him to do a new superhero movie, something like that, but he's like, I want to do this, it's a passion project, and studios wanted him to also make it in English to increase his budget, but Guillermo ended up sticking to his gun, sticking to his gut feeling, and his passion for the story got it made on $19 million, and he refused any salary and even any back-end money. So I don't even think he's made a dime off Pan's Labyrinth.
He didn't get paid at all. And the studios wanted to give him a ton of money, like tens of millions, to make it an American film. But obviously, his story is his own, and he felt that to make it an English language film would be a detriment to his story and what he had in mind for telling this film. And
he also wrote the subtitles himself for English because he doesn't trust translators. Because I know he said he's had issues with translators in the past with his films, translating them to English. And he's bilingual, obviously. And this was an entire this was an entire Spanish crew. So everyone on the crew spoke Spanish in the cast, except for Doug Jones, who plays the Faun and the Pale Man. He often works with Guillermo as kind of like his monster actor guy in a way.
Yeah, Doug Jones has also played Abe Sapien in Hellboy, and he also played the Chamberlain and the Angel of Death in Hellboy too as well, and he plays the Fishman in Shape of Water.
Yeah, so Doug had to actually learn Spanish and tried to focus on his dialect to actually run the lines with the characters, well, specifically with Ophelia in the film. And even though they ended up overdubbing it with a Spanish actor for vocal work for it to sound authentic, it's good that he still had that passion to try to learn the language, try to learn the dialect and the pronunciation, so that when they did do the voice dub over, it looks like a flawless transition with his mouth.
Doug Jones is an unsung hero of these Guillermo del Toro movies because it's very much like Andy Serkis doing motion capture, where he's covered in these prosthetics, whatever monster or creature he's playing, even if it's a main character. And he's such a talented physical performer. Every single being that he plays in Del Toro's movies is so unique and memorable. And I think that he must be extremely passionate about what he does because no one recognizes him, no one knows who he is, but he's a major part in many of Del Toro's movies, and he's also the reason why movies like The Shape of Water work so well, because he makes that character, that Fishman, he makes it personable and relatable and nuanced, and he does the same thing with the Faun here, where the Faun, he seems to be like a nefarious character. You aren't sure if he's a good part of the story, a good guy or a bad guy. And I think that Doug Jones's performance brings these layers to the Faun that makes it such an interesting and complex character in this film.
Yeah, I agree. And let's talk about him in a little bit, but I want to start on like the main cast, specifically Ivana Vaquero, who is absolutely phenomenal in this movie as Ophelia. And Guillermo originally wanted the character of Ophelia to be younger, around like 8-9 years old, but Ivana came in and she was like, I think 11 or 12 when she was cast, and she was so exceptional, and he kind of just fell in love with her as an actress and her performance that he worked the script differently so that it could be an older child for the story. And this film is a fairy tale, and like you were talking about earlier, how Guillermo, he uses a lot of mythology to kind of adapt or put into his films. And the thing with this movie, specifically compared to all of his films, I think Pan's Labyrinth, it feels the most like it's an old ancient fairy tale that's been told over centuries. That's how deep it is, and that's how strong the creativity and aesthetic of it are. And you can tell the love that he put into this film because of how exceptional it is, but it just feels like one of those stories that's passed down generation to generation, but it's insane that it came from him by himself.
And what I really adore about this movie is how dark it is. and how disturbing it can be. Like,
Don't let your kids watch this.
This is not a kids movie. This is, like I said earlier, it's an adult fairy tale. Adults just, there's a reason why it's rated R. Like, there's some serious gore. There's some really disturbing images and moments in this movie that younger viewers shouldn't be exposed to at such a young age. So there was a problem in Spain and I think in Spain,
Mexico and Spain,
in both countries when this film came out, because a lot of parents took their kids to see this movie thinking it was like, oh, it's a kids movie. I guess not paying attention to the rating close enough, but a lot of kids were very disturbed by what they saw, because there's some harsh imagery in this movie, and then the villain Captain Vidal is a very dark character, and he does some very heinous acts in this movie. But I think that's what works so well about this film, because we're so used to like fairy tales. It's like, it's Disney, and they're always very fluffy, and the villains are always like, yeah, they're evil, but like they're not doing anything horrible or disturbing.
They're not beating a man's face in with a glass bottle.
Exactly. So it's like we've always had like, they've always been G or PG rated. So they've always just been very kid friendly, these fairy tales. But throughout history, fairy tales actually have been very dark. If you look at the Brothers Grimm, their stories were very dark. The Hansel and Gretel stories like that they wrote, very dark, very disturbing things in it. So I think Del Toro is hearkening to those ancient fairy tales, those older fairy tales where they are written for adults and bad things happen to the characters, and this is his interpretation of that kind of story.
Disney basically monopolized these folk tales, because what he did was he adapted them and then he copyrighted them, and it was genius, and they're very successful and they're classics. But like you said, those fairy tales, they all have similar themes. They're very light at the end. Obviously, there are horror elements to some of them for sure. I'm not going to say there aren't. There are some scary moments. I mean, Bambi's pretty dark. There are dark moments in these movies, but it generally follows the same like structure. You know, a prince saves a princess. They live happily ever after.
The villain dies by falling off something, and you never really see Disney villains actually die. Like, they'll often fall off a ledge or whatever, and they just fall into the distance. And that's basically the most graphic scene you'll see in a Disney movie.
Yeah, but he also has a ton of fairy tale references in Pan's Labyrinth, including Ophelia's new red shoes at the end of the film when she's in her underworld kingdom reclaiming her throne. That's a reference to Dorothy's red shoes, red slippers in The Wizard of Oz. Ophelia entering the tree can be a reference to Alice in Wonderland tumbling down the rabbit hole. Pale Man is a reference to other child-eating ogres in folklore. And the toad underneath the tree could be a reference to the Frog Prince story, where
kissing the frog.
Yeah, kissing the frog and turning into a prince. So I'm sure there's a bunch of others that I missed, but that's like when I watched it, those are the ones that I noticed and picked up on.
And I really adore. I mean, you could compare the fairies to Tinkerbell.
For sure.
They look a lot like Tinkerbell, where they wear a very similar garb and get up.
But I love how the production design team, they had the fairies like have leaf wings to give them like this organic element and quality, just like the fawn. I love the design of the fawn, where it's not just like a goat man, which is like, ironically, Guillermo...
It's not James McAvoy.
Yeah, well, Guillermo actually turned down Chronicles of Narnia.
Oh, really?
And that has an actual fawn with James McAvoy playing one. But a fawn is a goat human, but they did it in such like an elemental earth quality in this film, where he's like, looks like a combination of tree and wood and stone and
earth.
Earth. Yeah, just elements of the earth, which is so fascinating.
Yeah, that makes sense, because he tells Ophelia that he's so old that only like the trees can know his name. So that's how ancient it is. Like, he's like as old as the forests that they're surrounded by.
Yeah, and there's really two storylines going on throughout this film. We have the reality of Ophelia's life as the son of this woman who just the daughter of this woman who just married a horribly evil captain in this fascist army. And I think this is like about like at the end of the Civil War era, where the fascism starting to take over and eliminating all the rebel forces at the time. And Captain Vidal is just this horrible person who is basically using her mother, Ophelia's mother, Carmen, is just a vessel for an heir to his supposed throne in his mind. And then...
there's actually a great nod to his obsession with his son. When he greets the girls, Ophelia and her mother, he actually says, "Bienvenidos," which is a welcome for in the masculine tense. Whereas if it's two women and you say hello and welcome to them, you would say bienvenidas. But he says the masculine on purpose because he's basically just welcoming his son only.
Yeah, and we'll get to his character in a little bit. But then the other storyline is this fantasy world that Ophelia has entered, which starts when she comes across that like ancient stone structure and she puts the eye back in, and then the fairy grasshopper little thing comes out, and that kind of kickstarts this fantasy of hers that she's living out. And it's like these two storylines that go on throughout the entire film until they collide at the end, and Guillermo just does a great job blending them together and referencing each other, and the transitions that he does from reality to fantasy is brilliant, whether he does it with pans with
Trees.
the trees, or he does it with audio too, with the wings flapping, and it's just a beautiful story of just two storylines. And I love the idea of, is Ophelia's storyline of her being this princess from this underworld, is it real or is it imagined? And I love that you can play around with it in your head of what you think is real or not.
Yeah, because you could look at it as her imagination because she's using this fabrication as a way of escaping the harsh realities of her life. And so you can definitely, and kids have such vivid imaginations, especially some more than others. And she could be escaping the real world into this fantasy world she's created for herself. But but you can also look at it as real. And I think it's more fun when you consider things like this whenever there's a movie and it comes into question, was it real, wasn't it real? I think I always prefer to say it's real because that makes the story better. And I think that if you say, oh, something's not real, or I think it was just all in their imagination, it sucks the life out of the movie.
Yeah, and an interesting thing that Guillermo does with this movie is he opens up the film with the end of the movie. He opens up the shot. Obviously, spoiler alert to this point, we've been pretty good. He opens the shot of Ophelia dying, dead, and he reverses it as we go into the story, into the fairy tale world.
And that's actually a moment where you can question whether it was all in her imagination, because he does the same thing that Bong Joon-ho did in Parasite, where he ends the film not in the imagination fantasy, but back on the lead character in their grim situation. And Del Toro does the same thing in this film where Ophelia, she seems to pass on to the afterlife where she is greeted by her immortal family who are a king and queen in this underworld, and everything seems great. But then Del Toro cuts back to Ophelia, and the last thing we see is Ophelia seems to recognize that she's made it to the afterlife, but she's not dead yet. And then we actually see her take her last breath, and then she dies in reality. So that is a moment where it can make you question whether it is imagination or not.
Yeah, and I love Ophelia. She's such a great character. She's this young, brave, curious girl who's grown up in a tragic environment. I mean, the Civil War of Spain was a horrific event, and it kind of is not disappeared from memory, but it's overshadowed by World War II, which started taking place right towards the end of it. So it's kind of forgotten in international history. I mean, I don't think we ever learned about it really in school. And so
I think because it didn't have as an expansive impact as World War II.
But you can imagine if World War II didn't happen, it'd be one of the biggest wars you heard about in history, because it ravaged the country of Spain. And it was during Francisco Franco, when he was the fascist dictator leader who took over Spain and ruled even after the time of this movie until 1975 as dictator, assuming the title Caudillo. And the Civil War in Spain was horrific. It occurred again right around the same time as World War II.
Yeah, Spain was dealing with the same thing that Italy was dealing with Mussolini, who was also a fascist leader of that country.
But the Civil War in Spain, I think what Guillermo does with this film is he's trying to keep the memory of it alive, and he's trying to represent the people who were lost and forgotten, or the people who died during that period, who were just trying to survive and get by. And this story, obviously, Captain Vidal represents the fascist regime that took over. And then Ophelia and her family can obviously represent the innocent people who suffered because of it.
You could also look at it as Captain Vidal is a very similar archetype to Michael Shannon's character in Shape of Water, where what Guillermo does is you have this movie where there are monstrous creatures, and it's fantastical, and there's you expect that the monster would be this horrible creature-like villain, and that there is like the Pale Man, and he's a horrible villain. But what he does with Vidal is he shows that the worst monster in this world is a man, and I think he's reflecting that human beings are capable of monstrous acts, and human beings can be their own villains in the world, and sometimes even the worst villain you face in your life is yourself. And so I think that Guillermo recognizes that we all have the ability to become a monster to some capacity based upon experience or whatever, or things that could happen to you or whatever. And I think that Ophelia represents the innocence within us, especially that we have when we're children and that we're born with, where Ophelia is young and she's pure and she's innocent and she's done no wrong. And I think that they are.
Yeah, and in Ophelia, she's basically on this magical quest. She's finds out from this faun that she's this lost princess of an underworld kingdom, and a kingdom that knows no pain or fear, only of peace and happiness, which is really all she wants. So that's why when you go back and forth between, is this all real? Is it a coping mechanism? Is she's trying to make up for the fact that she's known nothing but poverty and pain, and she's trying to create this fantasy to deal with her day-to-day life? And she moves there with her mother to this base camp, you could say, and Carmen she's really just trying to do what's best for her daughter, what she thinks. And I think what she does is she marries this powerful man, this well-off man, to have safety for her family. And she loves Ophelia very much, but she doesn't understand her daughter's fascination with fairy tales and books and this odd behavior that she has. And Carmen is definitely one of the biggest victims of the film, because not only does she have interactions with Ophelia that are negative, but also she's basically controlled by Captain Vidal, and Vidal has no emotions for her whatsoever. Again, he's using her just to create a baby, and he assumes it's going to be his son because he's so confident and full of arrogance.
Yeah, and he displays dominance upon everyone that surrounds him, and he's a very dominant figure. Like when Carmen first steps out of the car, the first thing Vidal does is order that she sit in a wheelchair for indefinitely, because he doesn't want anything to go wrong with the birth of his son.
Yeah, and he's a truly evil person, monster on Earth, one of the most horrific villains you'll ever see in film. And just within 15 minutes, you learn that, how he just destroys that man's face with a glass bottle and it never breaks.
And then he kills the farmers.
He executes both of them just because. Yeah. And then they find out that they had a viable excuse for what they were doing and where they were. And he doesn't care. And he also he hates himself in a way, and you could probably say that he hates himself as much as he hates other people. And I think Guillermo shows that clearly in one of the scenes that he's shaving, where he's looking in the mirror and he tries to slit his own throat in the mirror. He slits his own reflection's throat, and he clearly hates himself because he's basically being taunted from the dead by his father. And you can only imagine how hard his father was on him, not to justify anything he's done, but clearly a result of what his father did to him. And his father is constantly taunting him from the dead with that broken watch, where he died in battle on a field, and he broke his watch the moment he died so that he could always show his son, this is how a man dies on field, this is when I died. And he's always carrying that watch, he's always looking at that broken watch, and he's obsessed with fixing it and getting it running. And also his like chamber looks like the inside of a watch. There's like these large gears around him. So this watch of his father's last taunt is always on his mind.
He thinks that in his father's eyes, he was probably never good enough, so he never will be good enough in his own eyes.
Yeah, and you can contrast Vidal with the Pale Man, and they both sit at the heads of these very large tables with a bounty of food. They both consume the lives of the innocent. Just like the Pale Man eats children, Vidal kills Ophelia at the end of the film. They're both power hungry in a way. Vidal's power hungry with his fascism. The Pale Man, he uses his bounty on his table to lure children in and entices them with the food. And as soon as they take a bite of the food, that's when he goes to attack them. Whereas the captain does the same thing. He lures those citizens, those special high-class citizens, with a bounty and a feast to control them and their actions, you could say. So they're very similar characters, almost complete mirror reflections of each other.
I mean, the Pale Man is literally what Nightmare Fuel is made of.
For real, dude.
It's unbelievable.
I squirm every time I watch that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable creature design, and it's so disturbing when you see the murals in his basement with like he's just like eating children. It's really disturbing, and I think that the metaphor of the buffet, I think it serves a very important metaphor for the film in terms of a religious metaphor, because Ophelia is told not to eat the fruit, not to eat the food, not to touch anything, and just to get in and get out.
And she's warned multiple times that the monster eats children.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that bounty of that buffet of food on the table represents the Garden of Eden. And the grapes she takes, you could say, are the apple that Adam and Eve bite into, and the pale man is the snake. And it's a metaphor for the original sin of humans being inherently filled with sin. And I think that Ophelia is literally carrying out the same act as the Adam and Eve story.
Yeah, that's interesting for sure. But I also look at it, why did Ophelia eat that grape despite obtaining the dagger that she had to get, obtaining her mission, succeeding for that part. And even though she sees in the ceiling those disturbing beings of this monster that eats children, and I always also wonder who painted those. Maybe the monster painted them. But if I had to guess, outside of a symbolic reference of why she ate the grapes, Ophelia has been living in this civil war Spain, and she's been living in extreme poverty. She's probably malnourished. And to see such a lush and juicy looking grape, she obviously couldn't resist herself. And her reaction to just eating a grape is like, this is the greatest thing I've ever eaten in my life. And also, Ophelia was punished the night before where, remember, her mother says you're going to bed hungry without a meal, because that's the night that she ruined her dress when she went under the tree. And so I'm sure she was starving at this point. But I think both of those are probably correct.
Yeah, I think we can definitely.
And this monster's just terrifying because he collects those shoes as trophies, which can, of course, also be a metaphor for the Holocaust, where children and millions of children and adults were just killed by a horrific fascist regime. And there are remnants of just like the clothing and whatever was left behind of those people. And they are kind of like ghosts that just disappeared from the world.
Yeah, I think that Del Toro took a lot of inspiration, especially from Schindler's List, for that part. And also, I think that you could compare Vidal to Amon Goth big time.
I would 100%.
Yeah, 100%. And the Pale Man is so creepy. And Doug Jones, once again, with his physical performances, is so memorable. And it's so terrifying when it's chasing Ophelia through the hallway and her chalk door closes up and she has to open a new one. I think that's one of the best moments of the film, and she finally wisely goes to the ceiling so she can shut it on its face.
Yeah, his design, it looks like Guillermo wanted to create a monster who looks like it just sits like that for ages, like centuries, millennia maybe. It just sits in that position, and so like no leg muscle growth and just flabby skin hanging down, and it's just like that arched back. But also I like to think why doesn't it have eyes in its head, and why can it only use its eyes in its hand, and it only has those nostrils in its head? Maybe because it's a monster of such evil nature that it's so blinded and obscured the view it has of the world that it can only see things in a certain way. And the Pale Man's also inspired by the painting Saturn Devouring His Son by Francesco Goya. I think he was a Spanish painter at the time of the Spanish Civil War too.
It's a very famous painting,
and maybe that could be symbolic. The character and that painting itself could be symbolic of the Spanish Civil War, where this country basically consumed itself. Let's head on over to our intermission of this episode, which is brought to you by our sponsor, Manscaped. Use our coupon code Raiders of the Lost at checkout for 20% off and free shipping today at manscaped.com.
Oh, I'm ready for this one.
You ready for this intermission? So those of you who are new to our intermissions, we do fun little trivia questions for each other and a movie quote contest. So we'll start with the movie quote competition.
Let's go.
You want to go first or me?
I'll go first.
Go first, yeah. We'll mix it up. Anthony's going to go first. Okay. Now we'll have to guess the movie.
Okay, ready?
Ready.
It's a fake. There's no crease in the paper. When your mom hands you a note to miss school, the first thing you do is you fold it.
Catch me if you can.
And you put it in your pocket. I mean, if it's real, where's the crease?
That's when Frank is telling the girl to fold the paper when she's trying to skip class.
Yeah.
Good one.
I love that movie.
Me too.
I knew you'd get that because I know you adore that movie.
Dude, I've seen the movie like 20 times. Yeah. Catch Me If You Can is one of my favorite Spielberg movies. It's one of my, probably like in my top 30.
It's underrated.
It's so good. We should do an episode on it.
Yeah.
Anyways. All right. This is a good one. I have two in case you don't get the first one because,
it's challenging.
All right. I wouldn't say it's challenging. It's just that I don't know how recently you've seen this movie.
Okay.
I met Sammy through work. Insurance. I was an investigator. I'd investigate the claims to see which ones are phony. I had to see through people's bullshit. It was a useful experience because now it's my life.
Say it again.
I met Sammy through work, insurance. I was an investigator. I'd investigate the claims to see which ones are phony. I had to see through people's bullshit. It was a useful experience because now it's my life.
I feel like I know this.
I'll give you another one, all right?
Yeah.
Because this one's kind of tough because it's a great script. My wife deserves vengeance. Doesn't make any difference whether I know about it. Just because there are things I don't remember doesn't make my actions meaningless.
Memento.
Yeah, and that one's easy.
That one's easy,
Yeah, I
yeah.
wanted to give you the hard one first.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, now let's guess the movie release year.
Okay. Boogie Nights.
It's not the 90s. Is it? It's the 90s.
You can't do that.
All right,
You did this baiting thing last time. You're like, was it the same
All right,
year as
all right.
Batman Begins?
Okay.
No baiting.
Okay. 2001.
It was the 90s.
97. 97? Wow.
Magnolia came out in 2000.
Yeah, I was trying to go back in his filmography.
Yeah.
Man, that's an old movie. Holy crap.
very old.
Because I was also trying to like go through Mark Wahlberg's career.
Think about how young he looks in it.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
He's a kid because that was pretty close to Fear when that came out.
Yeah. It was a couple years after Fear.
All right. Unforgiven
1992.
2.
No. Man, these release years are harder than I thought they would be.
All right, let's do a movie pop quiz.
All right, it's an actor actually in Boogie Nights. I did a Boogie Nights double special. It's a double feature.
All right, let's go.
Okay, Don Cheadle's been nominated for 1 Oscar. What was the movie? It was like his big breakout, big time.
Hotel Rwanda.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
You got it, man.
That's a great movie.
Yeah.
That is a tragic movie.
Yeah.
All right. In The Wizard of Oz, what was used to simulate snow during the poppy scene? What was the fake snow used in The Wizard of Oz?
Oh, I've read this.
It's a highly toxic
Oh, it's
item.
I know what it is. Hold on, I'm just trying. It's in buildings. What's that poisonous? Can I call a friend? I can't think of what it's called. It's like super poisonous, and it's in old buildings. I can't think of the name.
Asbestos.
Asbestos.
Yeah, they actually used 100% asbestos, and they didn't know how toxic it was.
No one did.
Crazy. It's like lead paint.
Oh my god,
It's good.
that was a good one.
All right, that ends our intermission. Let's get back into Pan's Labyrinth. Since we've talked about the monsters, let's get into not the monsters, but the creatures, which I love so much. So the fawn, again, played by Doug Jones, is so fascinating. I love the design, the creature design. It was actually almost completely practical. The suit actually was all practical, where Doug Jones, he was in like the fawn suit, and his legs he was wearing green screen socks basically up to his knees. And so that allowed him to walk in this suit normally, but it looks like the appendages of the legs kind of like
They're behind his
they're
like
bent backwards.
Yeah. It's
So
like
they-
chicken feet.
Yeah, basically. So they just CGI'd his legs out, and the fawn's legs are like that, and it gives him that interesting goat-like walk. And what is the fawn exactly? So fawn's an ancient creature in specifically Roman mythology and Greek mythology. It's a half-human, half-goat creature. It's a symbol of peace and fertility. And I love how you brought up earlier where the fawn in this movie, it seems to both be trustworthy, but also at the same time deceitful in a way. Like, you can't, is it always telling the truth? Is it trying to take advantage of Ophelia? We never really know what its true intentions are because it's such a mystery to us and to Ophelia.
Yeah, because what happens is at first he seems trustworthy at first, but also he's very scary looking. He's gigantic, and he's like a monstrous creature. So it's kind of alarming, but he seems to be aiding Ophelia, and he seems to know a lot about her, and so she's very intrigued by him. And then what happens is after she fails the Pale Man test, when she eats the grapes and causing 2 of the fairies to be killed, the fawn becomes very angry with her and tells her it's over. Like, he's like, I'm out of here. You ruined it. That's exactly what he says.
In Spanish.
Yeah. But then mysteriously he comes back to Ophelia, and he's giving her another chance, but it seems like he's keeping something from her, or he wants something nefarious to happen. And we ultimately learn that he is implying that they need to take some blood from her baby brother. But it seems like he wants to do more than that. It seems like It's like he's implying that they're going to sacrifice the brother to achieve the third goal. So he becomes like a kind of a villainous person, not person Fawn.
Yeah, the Fawn basically comes into her life and tells her that she's this long-lost princess of this secret underground world, and has a chance to reclaim her throne at the end of the full moon, but she has to complete 3 tasks, and the first one is obtaining the key inside the giant toad underneath the dying tree in the forest, which she has to go inside, and she puts those 3 stones inside the toad, and it's really gross, and it burps up like an embryo, or like it almost looks like what's it called when a woman gives birth, the sac, the placenta that comes out. It's kind of reminiscent of that. I think there's a lot of pregnancy symbolism in this film, and that's, I think, one of them. And then she pulls the key out, and she uses that key in the Pale Man's dungeon to get the golden dagger, which she gives to the Fawn. But there's a theme of disobedience in this film, where Ophelia doesn't do the final task in time for the moonlight, and that's when Fawn goes away and disappears. And disobedience is all over this movie. You know, Ophelia is this character who, right from the get-go, you can tell has a problem with authority. She's probably had this problem her entire life, or entire childhood, growing up in Civil War Spain, where when she meets Captain Vidal, she holds out her left hand instead of her right. She knows that it's her right hand to shake someone's hand, but she purposely lets out her left hand. Again, that second mission she doesn't do quickly enough.
But she also refuses to call him her father.
Exactly. So she does refuse to call the father, despite Carmen always telling her to. She also fails in that second mission, where she lets 2 of the fairies get eaten because she ate the grape. She fortunately escapes. And then at the end of the film, another act of major disobedience by Ophelia is when you said that the final task is to give the baby brother to the Fawn to slay it, you can assume, or sacrifice it to enter the kingdom, to get the drops of blood into the portal. She gives up her throne, refuses to obey the Fawn, and she remains mortal on Earth to die like humans because she disobeys the Fawn. So there's a lot of disobedience in this film. Also, other forms of disobedience. The Doctor and Mercedes both disobey the captain throughout the story. The rebels disobey the entire fascist takeover. And Ophelia disobeys her mother throughout the entire film as well.
There's also this continued theme of threes in this movie. So you have 3 creatures: the frog, the fawn, and the pale man. And then you have 3 members in the royal family: Ophelia and her 2 immortal parents in the underworld. You have 3 tasks that she has to accomplish. And also 3 people in her family: Ophelia, Carmen, and Captain Vidal. So 3s, and also 3 fairies as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Actually purposely done by Del Toro.
There's a really interesting way that Ophelia kind of enters her fantasy realm, you could say, which is actually, you just made me think of, is when she tells the stories to her mother's pregnant belly to her brother, to tell him fairy tales to calm him down. And she, tells that fairy tale of that single rose on the top of that mountain that make anybody immortal, but everyone's afraid to go grasp it because all the poisonous thorns that surround it. And she seems to use the womb of her brother to kind of enter that realm and enter that fantasy world. And again, there's fallopian imagery throughout this entire film. The fawn's head, the book, when it becomes red, when her mother is almost having that miscarriage. The tree itself looks like fallopian tubes in a way, and the bed frame even. So there's a lot of, you can say, pregnancy imagery throughout this entire film. And even, like I said, when the toad burps up that sack.
There's even the fawn's head is on the bed frame.
Yes, that's what I meant, the bed frame, yeah.
And then the fawn's head is also on the front opening of the maze as well.
And the staircase.
The labyrinth.
Bottom of the staircase.
Yeah, so the fawn is everywhere, which is really interesting. All these little Easter eggs.
Yeah, and also those could be probably clues that Guillermo's trying to show you that, like, this fairy tale is real. It's really happening because, and I like to go on the side, like with you, where I think it's all true because that makes it more fun. This is real. It's not imaginary. It's not fake. It's a real fairy tale that's happening to Ophelia, because one of the main examples, I think, is the chalk. So she gets this chalk from the fawn that anytime she draws a door, it's a portal that can open, and she can open a door like through the floor, through the wall. and she uses that chalk to get into Captain Vidal's chamber later in the film, which was locked. So how could she possibly get in there if the chalk didn't help her get inside, you know? So I think that's one of the little hints that Guillermo's trying to tell you, that it actually is real.
It seems as though she activates the entire fantastical realm when she puts that eye back into the statue in the opening. It seems like her doing that springs the story into action. And I think that the most telling sign that this is actually really happening to her is a scene with her mother, who when she's very ill, and then Ophelia puts the mandrake and milk underneath her bed in the bowl. And then when the captain takes the mandrake and shows it to the mother, and Carmen like yells at Ophelia, not understanding why this weird root is under her bed, she tosses it into the fireplace in the fire. And then once the mandrake root starts burning in the flames, Carmen goes into extreme labor immediately. And so I think that showed that there was a connection between the fantastical realm and the real realm.
I can actually counter that with what someone would say if they believed that it was all fantasy. So what you're saying is the mandrake proves that because the mandrake helped heal Carmen or make her feel better.
They ended up being connected.
Yeah.
And so I think the mandrake took her illness away.
Yeah. So she puts the mandrake in the warm milk, in the fresh milk, to heal her mother, who had that blood almost miscarriage accident. And so if you're on the argument that it's not real, you could say that the reason why Carmen got better after that scare is because she was forced to bed rest without anyone near her. And you could say that you could argue that Captain Vidal is what causes her immense stress and fear, and maybe that's what causes her to go into miscarriage and causes her to go into labor. But because she's away from him for so long, she's able to recover and able to rest up and able to relax. But because whenever Captain Vidal's around, she can't relax and she's completely stressed out. And that's why when the mandrake is thrown into the fire, because Captain Vidal is there, you could say that's why Carmen goes into labor, because she's so stressed out because Vidal is there.
No, you're right, because Vidal, he's yelling at both of them, and it's extremely stressful. And so that could have set off the labor for sure. And that's a great point.
And you can tell that and you can say in the opening of the film, when they're in the car there, Carmen's very sick to her stomach. And yeah, you could say it's because she's pregnant, but it also can be because she's so stressed out that she is bringing her child to this person who she knows is a monster and knows is the father of her child.
A man is the real monster in this story, and that's humanity has monstrous capabilities within it. And that is a sign of, fascism with this civil war, and then also with the Nazi fascist movement in the Soviet Union. And I think that Guillermo, the reason why he said it in a war-torn civil war era of Spain is with this fascist takeover, is because I think he's showing the monstrous side of humanity and what men are capable of doing to each other.
And there's one other instance where people who maybe believe that it's all fake and not real is at the end of the film, when Ophelia is running with her brother after she rescues him from Vidal temporarily, and is running with the baby to find the faun in the labyrinth, and she makes it there, and she's talking to the faun, and the faun's trying to get the baby from her. And then Vidal is chasing after her too, and then when Vidal shows up at the center of the labyrinth, it cuts to his point of view, and he doesn't see anything there. There's no faun, and Ophelia is just talking to nothing in his point of view. But you got to also remember, so you could say that it's all fake because he didn't see anything, but you can also remember from his point of view at this point, Ophelia had just put a ton of sleep medication in his whiskey that he was drinking, so you can't trust his perspective at this point.
But also, you can also say that she's not a mortal being. She's an immortal, so probably only other immortals like her can see something like the faun.
Yeah, I think actually that's probably more accurate than stupid sleeping potion.
No, you made a great point, man.
I appreciate it, man.
And I love this ending because like I said earlier, I look at it as a happy ending for Ophelia because she's finally reunited with her family, and she gets to finally, I think, whether even if it is real and the magical part isn't real, you could say that she does enter heaven, and she can finally know peace for the first time in her life and comfort, something that she's been missing her entire life, and her life has been devoid of. And also, one of my favorite scenes is when Captain Vidal meets his end when he exits the labyrinth with his son, and the rebel forces are just standing there waiting for him, and he gives his son to Mercedes. He gives his son to Mercedes, and he begins saying that give this watch to my son, and I want him to know. And she cuts him off and says, he's not even gonna know your name. And then they kill him. And I think that death is the second worst thing that could have happened to him. I think that his son not knowing who his son not knowing who he is or was probably his biggest fear in life, and the last thing he ever wanted to happen.
Let's head on over to our superlatives, and let's start off with who's the MVP of this film. And I'm going to actually just say it's Mercedes, because she's like the ultimate protector in a way. She's living this double life. She's very brave because she's living with this monster Vidal, but she's also working for the rebels. Her brother Pedro is the leader of the resistance that is located in the woods that Vidal is trying to track down and kill. And she's helping them with supplies and medication. So isn't the doctor, who is also a very brave person. But Mercedes, she's so caring and helpful to young Ophelia. She makes sacrifices for her, makes sacrifices for the rebels. And her and Ophelia are very mirrored characters in a way. They have similar story arcs where Mercedes and Ophelia both get a key. They both have a knife as a tool. And they're both asked to give up their younger brother's lives, but they ultimately refuse both of those.
You know that actress is the same lead actress from Y Tu Mama Tambien?
I thought I recognized her, man.
Yeah,
I thought I did.
That's her. That's a good choice. My MVP is Doug Jones, because he does so much in this movie, and he makes the fantastical believable. And the amount of suffering and pain and discomfort that guy put up with
5 hours of makeup.
Yeah, and just being in those heavy suits. Like, apparently the horns on the fawn alone weighed 10 pounds each.
Yeah, plus the whole head that he's wearing, it's all mechanical, and somebody's operating these components inside his head. He can't hear anything. He can't even hear what Ophelia's saying.
Yeah, and I think that so many filmmakers, the first thing they'd want to do is to make it CGI and make it like motion capture. But what he does, making it real and keeping it an on-set practical effect, makes all the difference in the world. And I think that he makes the world and this film better.
What's the best scene?
The Pale Man scene.
Oh my god,
so scary.
Terrifying.
Yeah,
terrifying
so scary.
scene. I squirm every time I watch it when she's running away from the Pale Man.
Yeah.
Oh man. I think the best scene for me is when Pedro shoots Captain Vidal.
Yeah.
Right in the face. Right in his cheek, and his eye just rolls backwards.
It's just like Jeremy Renner's death in The Town, like right in the cheek. Best shot.
Best shot. My favorite shot in the movie is when Ophelia enters the tree, and Guillermo gets this beautiful shot from inside the tree, looking at her as she enters, and she's basically like silhouetted like a doorway. It's beautiful.
My favorite shot is the opening shot, because it's in reverse, and it's the end of the film. And I just love how the blood pours up back into her nose, and it's a really intriguing first shot of a movie, and it gets your attention right away.
Yeah, you just love it because it's like a Chris Nolan shot.
Yeah, in reverse. It's inverted.
Best actor, I'm going to go with Ivana. She's phenomenal in this movie. An amazing child actor performance.
Yeah, I'd say her too. She carries the movie, and she has some really great, difficult, emotional scenes that she pulls off. Especially, I think that scene when she's crying, talking to her brothers is a great
asking
scene.
her not to kill her mother.
Yeah.
It's real. Yeah. It's very emotional.
Yeah.
Best line.
I would say the doctor says to Vidal, when Captain Vidal asks him why he disobeyed him and why he didn't listen to his orders, the doctor says, "But Captain, to obey just like that for obedience's sake, without questioning, that's something only people like you do."
And my favorite line in the film, which you actually brought up earlier, is at the end, right before Pedro shoots Captain Vidal, and Vidal's like, tell my son. And then Mercedes cuts him off, and she goes, "He won't even know your name." Boom, right in the face.
Mic drop.
Basically.
Want to do some fun trivia?
Let's do it.
Stephen King attended a screening of the film and sat next to Guillermo del Toro during the screening. And according to Del Toro, King squirmed when the Pale Man chased Ophelia through that hallway. Also my favorite, most disturbing scene. And Del Toro compared the experience of seeing King's reaction to winning an Oscar, which he eventually did with Shape of Water.
You know, earlier you brought up how Guillermo is kind of a contradiction where he makes these horror films and he's obsessed with monsters, but he's a super nice, gentle being in person. Stephen King's very similar to that too, where people are like terrified to approach him because they think he's like this evil, like I love horror and all this. Whereas Stephen King is the same. He's a very nice guy. He comes up with such great ideas. He says it's because he's just terrified of everything.
He's also a Red Sox fan. Go Sox.
Go Sox, kid. Yeah, let's go.
Go Sox. It took 5 hours for Doug Jones to get into the Pale Man costume. And once he was in it, he had to look out the nose holes in order to see what was going on.
The coloring in this movie is phenomenal. And remember, this movie also won Best Cinematography, and it actually beat Children of Men, which Emmanuel Lubezki did, Alfonso Cuarón's movie. So that's like could go either way for me. Both films are aesthetically phenomenal. I probably would have given it to Children of Men just because of the technology they created with a lot of those Steadicam shots. I mean, handheld shots. But this is a beautiful film, and the use of color is significant in this movie too, where Del Toro points out to people that the scenes that with Ophelia tend to have circles and curves and use warm colors, while scenes with Captain Vidal in the war have more straight lines and use cold colors. And over the course of the film, these two opposite colors gradually intrude on one another, and there are later scenes that have the contrast of those warm colors and tones with the cold tones. And there's a ton of beautiful shots, and one of them is the fireplace in the bedroom, and another one is at the end when there's the battle going on, and Vidal is like surrounded by the blueness of the night, and then there's the explosion behind him. So there's a bunch of beautiful contrasting shots like that.
Yeah, this is the strongest early sign of Del Toro's vision, which often employs the contrast of blue and orange in his color palette. It's most prominently seen in the Hellboy movies, and also the TV show he created, The Strain.
That vicious bottle attack, it actually comes from an incident in Del Toro's life. Del Toro and a friend were once in a fight during which he and his friends were just beaten up to a pulp in the street by a bunch of people, and he actually saw his friend getting beaten in the face with a bottle by one of these guys, and the bottle didn't break at all, so that always stuck with him with his entire life, and he actually used it in this film.
That makes me cringe, man. The fawn in the movie was actually inspired by a lucid dream that Del Toro repeatedly had when he was a child. Every night he would wake up and he would see a fawn step out from behind a grandfather clock in his room.
That wraps our episode on Pan's Labyrinth. Please go to RaidersOfLostPodcast.com. Check out all of our content. Head on over to Patreon.com/RaidersOfLostPodcast. Become a patron today. Thank you so much. Really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't seen this movie, check it out.
Adios, amigos.
Thank you for watching Raiders of the Lost podcast. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Listen to the audio format of Raiders of the Lost podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes every Monday and Thursday. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Raiders of the Lost podcast.